Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a very significant paper just published. It's in the International Journal of Cardiovascular Research and Innovation.
That's right, and it's all about adverse reactions linked to the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. Super important point. It's open access, so you, the listener, can actually go and read it yourselves.
Absolutely. So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to pull out the key findings from what some are calling, a definitive paper on this.
Yeah, we want to understand what it tells us about vaccine safety, especially maybe compared to what we thought we knew before.
And to do that, the paper looks at a whole lot of data sources. We're talking the VA-ERA system, that's the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System.
Right, VA-ERA, plus clinical trial results, the post-marketing surveillance that happens after rollout.
Big observational studies, and they're looking at it from all angles, too. Epidemiological, clinical, immunological viewpoints. It's thorough.
And they kind of set the scene by looking at VA-ERA's data going way back, 1990 right up to 2024.
And what stands out there?
Well, what immediately jumps out is 2021. The year the vaccines really rolled out wide, there was just this huge spike in reported adverse events and, sadly, deaths.
Okay, but we need to be fair here, right?
Yeah.
As the paper acknowledges, way more vaccines were given in 2021.
Definitely. More vaccines mean you'd expect more reports. That makes sense. But the authors argue the scale of the increase, the sheer magnitude, goes way beyond just the number of shots given. It's disproportionate.
Which is quite striking.
And they don't bury the lead, as they say. The paper states its main conclusion very clearly right up front.
And that is?
They're urging governments to pull the COVID-19 mRNA products off the market. Full stop.
Wow, okay. That's a big statement. Why?
Their argument centers on the documented risk of myocarditis, that's damage to the heart muscle especially, they highlight, in young men under 40.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Because this isn't just a short opinion piece, is it?
Not at all. It's hefty. We're talking 43 pages, and get this, 341 references.
341. That's incredible.
Yeah, it shows they've really synthesized, pulled together a massive amount of the existing research on this whole topic.
So what are some of the key things they found when they crunched all that data?
Well, one really interesting finding is about the types of adverse events. They found the variety, the different kinds of problems reported with mRNA vaccines, was 6.2 times higher than expected.
6.2 times higher, even after accounting for more shots being given.
Exactly. They factor in that about 2.3 times more vaccines were given in the period they looked at. So you'd maybe expect 2.3 times the variety of issues, perhaps, but no, it was 6.2 times.
What does that suggest? Compared to, say, a regular flu shot?
It suggests these mRNA vaccines might be interacting with the body in, well, more complex or widespread ways than traditional vaccines. The paper even has a chart showing way more categories of reactions for the COVID shots versus the flu shot. It makes you wonder about the systemic effects.
Right, a much broader impact potentially. And what about just the raw number of reports?
That's another standout figure. The paper says the number of adverse events reported for COVID-19 vaccines was 118 times higher than for flu vaccines in VA-ERS.
118 times higher.
Yep. And again, even if you adjust for the 2.3 times more COVID shots given, 118 is still just astronomically higher than an expected 2.3 times increase.
That is a massive difference. It really begs the question of what's going on there.
It certainly does. The scale of the reporting is just dramatic.
So who is being affected most, according to this paper and the VA-ERS data?
Well, reports came in across all age groups. They do mention specific numbers for the little ones under 4 and the 5 to 11-year-olds.
Okay.
But here's a crucial bit. When they normalize the data looking at reports per million doses given in each age group.
So adjusting for population size and vaccination rates within groups.
Exactly. When they did that, the highest incidence, the highest rate of adverse reactions per million doses was actually seen in younger adults.
Interesting. So while kids were affected, the risk relative to the number of doses was highest for younger adults.
That's what their analysis of the VA-ERS data suggests, yeah.
The paper also tries to explain the how, particularly for myocarditis, this heart inflammation. Can you walk us through their explanation?
Sure. So they explain that after the shot, these little lipid nanoparticles, they're like the delivery vehicles for the mRNA.
Right, the fatty bubbles carrying the instructions.
Yeah. They don't just stay in your arm muscle. They found evidence they distribute around the body, and that includes getting into the heart tissue.
Okay, so they travel, then what?
Once they're in the heart, the mRNA gets taken up by the heart muscle cells themselves, the myocytes.
Then the myocytes follow the mRNA instructions.
And start producing the spike protein, the same protein that's on the outside of the coronavirus. This spike protein then gets presented on the surface of those heart muscle cells.
And that's the problem. The immune system sees it.
Precisely. The immune system flags that spike protein on the heart cell surface as foreign, as something that shouldn't be there.
So it attacks its own heart cells.
Essentially, yes. It launches an attack against those cells displaying the spike protein. That attack causes inflammation myocarditis. The paper also mentions finding fibrotic tissue, that's scar tissue, and inflammatory cells in heart tissue samples from affected people. That shows both damage and the body trying, maybe imperfectly, to heal.
And we keep hearing about young males. Does the paper confirm that increased risk?
It does, quite clearly. The data points to young males, particularly in the 12 to 24 age range, having the highest risk of myocarditis after vaccination.
How much higher?
With the Moderna vaccine, they report the risk was up to 7 times higher compared to females in the same age bracket.
Wow. Any idea why?
The paper touches on the possibility that testosterone might play a role, perhaps sort of amplifying the immune response in the heart in males. It's a potential factor they mention.
What about dosage and timing? Did that seem to make a difference?
Yes. The paper highlights that the risk of myocarditis seems to peak after the second dose. And they also found that shorter time intervals between the first and second dose were linked to higher rates of myocarditis.
So spacing them out more might have been less risky.
That's what the data suggests, yes.
And the difference between Pfizer and Moderna. There's been a lot of talk about that.
The paper addresses that directly. Their analysis points to the Moderna vaccine carrying a significantly higher risk of myocarditis, about 3 to 5 times higher compared to Pfizer.
Any reason given for that difference?
The most likely explanation they propose is simply the dose the Moderna vaccine contains a higher concentration of mRNA than the Pfizer one.
But they weren't exactly thrilled with the Pfizer risk either, were they?
No, that's a key point. Even though Pfizer seemed lower risk relative to Moderna, the authors state that the adverse reaction rate associated even with Pfizer is still, in their view, unacceptably high.
Okay, those numbers are concerning. What about the long-term picture for people who got myocarditis after the vaccine? Is it always mild and temporary?
Well, the data presented in the paper suggests otherwise, unfortunately. They report that a really high percentage, between 84 and 96%, of the Moderna-linked myocarditis cases actually needed hospital treatment.
That doesn't sound mild.
No.
Huh.
And worse, they found that around 50% of those hospitalized cases showed signs of long-term abnormalities in their heart muscle on follow-up.
So potential permanent damage, like
Yeah.
scarring.
Exactly, like the scarring they mentioned finding in pathology slides. It points towards lasting damage in a substantial portion of cases. And really tragically, they cite studies indicating a fatality rate associated with post-mRNA vaccine myocarditis of somewhere between 10 and 20%.
10 to 20% fatality. That's incredibly serious.
It is. It really challenges the narrative that these cases are uniformly mild or transient.
Yeah, it really does. So this paper seems to be directly confronting some common arguments, or maybe misconceptions. Let's go through a few. What about the claim that getting COVID itself is riskier for myocarditis than the vaccine?
The paper tackles that head-on. Their analysis suggests, especially for the Moderna shot, that the vaccine itself might actually pose a higher risk of myocarditis than a COVID infection, particularly in those younger age groups who generally have a lower risk from the virus itself.
So they're saying the risk calculation might flip for certain people.
That's the implication of their findings, yes. It contradicts that common assertion.
Okay, what about the idea that vaccine-related myocarditis, when it does happen, is mostly mild?
The paper argues strongly against that based on the evidence they compiled. While some cases might be mild, they document these long-term heart issues, the hospitalizations, and, as we just discussed, even deaths. They stress we might not know the full long-term picture yet.
Right, the possibility of hidden long-term consequences. And the big one, the overall risk-benefit balance. The argument that the benefits of the shots clearly outweigh any risks.
Well, based on their exhaustive review, the authors argue the evidence contradicts that broad claim. They contend the documented risks, especially the heart issues, seriously challenge the idea that the benefits always outweigh the risks, particularly when you look at specific age groups and their baseline risk from COVID.
The paper also mentioned something about overall cardiovascular deaths in 2021.
Yes, they briefly note an observed uptick in deaths linked to underlying major cardiovascular diseases in 2021.
Coinciding with the vaccine rollout.
Coinciding with the rollout, yes. They mention insurance data as one possible place this trend is showing up. It's another piece of the puzzle, raising more questions about broader cardiovascular health impacts during that time.
And just circling back to myocarditis rates, quickly, they broke it down by dose number 2, right?
Yes, when they looked at the VA-EARS myocarditis reports based on age and which dose it was, first, second, booster, the pattern held.
Hmm.
The highest rates were consistently seen in teens and young adults, especially after those initial doses.
Reinforcing that specific group's vulnerability.
Exactly.
Now, this paper's findings seem to echo concerns raised by others, like Dr. Kurt Milholm. Can you remind us who he is?
Sure. Dr. Kurt Milholm, he's a senior fellow specializing in pediatrics and cardiology affiliated with the Independent Medical Alliance.
Okay.
And his work, which we've looked at before, essentially brings together findings from a whole range of studies that have come out since 2021, all pointing towards this link between the vaccines and heart inflammation. Again, especially in young adults, particularly males, he's been synthesizing the broader research landscape.
What specific studies did Dr. Milholm find particularly compelling?
He often highlighted a very large Nordic study. It involved something like 23 million young people.
Wow, huge sample size.
Massive, and it found the lowest myocarditis rates in the unvaccinated. Then the risk increased with each dose received, and it was notably higher with the Moderna vaccine.
Consistent with this new paper's findings.
Very consistent. And Milholm always stressed the context. For generally healthy kids and young adults, COVID-19 itself usually presents a very mild risk, so you have to weigh the vaccine risk against that baseline.
Did he comment on the longer-term effects too, like the mild and transient question?
He did. He pointed to a Lancet study that followed kids who got vaccine-related myocarditis. Even 90 days later, while some blood markers might have normalized, cardiac MRIs were still showing signs of ongoing inflammation and, crucially, potential scarring in some of them.
So, evidence of lasting changes.
Yes. And he also brought up a Yale study that was quite startling. It found spike protein, which itself is considered potentially cardiotoxic, persisting in some individuals for over 700 days post-vaccination.
700 days. That completely challenges the idea that the spike protein just disappears quickly, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It suggests a much more prolonged presence and potential for interaction in the body than initially assumed, at least for some people.
So, Dr. Milholm's takeaway, combining all these different study threads.
His conclusion was basically that for these healthy young people where COVID risk is low, the potential long-term impacts of vaccine myocarditis, the inflammation, the scarring, this persistent spike protein can be really significant, even devastating for those affected. The risks just don't necessarily align with the benefits for everyone in that group.
Okay, so pulling it all together then, this big new paper we've been dissecting, plus the analysis from people like Dr. Milholm, it really paints quite a concerning picture, doesn't it? Especially around myocarditis, long-term heart health, and this recurring theme of young males being disproportionately affected by the mRNA vaccines.
It certainly does. The paper presents strong evidence pointing towards, a significant risk of myocarditis, potential long-term heart damage, and just a generally higher rate of adverse events, both in number and variety compared to what we see with other vaccines. It's definitely cause for careful consideration.
Which brings us back to that stark recommendation from the paper's authors.
Exactly. Their call for governments to urgently remove these mRNA products from the market based on this accumulated evidence of risk.
So for you listening, processing all this, it really forces some big questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Questions about public health strategy, about what constitutes truly informed consent when we roll out new technologies so rapidly.
And how do we properly balance potential benefits against documented risks, especially when those risks seem to hit certain groups much harder than others?
What does this deep dive make you think? What further questions does it spark about how we navigate these complex issues moving forward?
It's definitely a lot to mull over. And the authors put a huge amount of work into this paper. We really encourage you, if you're interested, to find it. It's open access in the International Journal of Cardiovascular Research and Innovation. Go look at the data and analysis for yourself.
Yeah, there's so much more detail in the full paper than we could possibly cover here. It's worth exploring directly.